how's it going? I have a tag for you, and this is the My Reading Life in 10 Books tag, which was created by Kelly from over at Books I'm Not Reading. And she sort of tagged me in the comments of her original video. She unfortunately ended up having to repost the tag, but she did comment. Tag me in the comments section of her first video. So I considered myself tagged, and I think it's a really cool idea for a tag. And this is just a tag where you name 10 books that kind of made you as a reader. And I think for me, and the way that I put it together, it's also kind of how I was made as a person to a smaller degree. But anyway, I've actually decided to come up with sort of superlatives for my different books, and so each book has kind of a label for it, for the superlative that it fills in terms of my own like personality as a person and as a reader. And the first one unfortunately has a curse word, but you know, just beware. But anyway, so I will stop with the preamble and get to the first entry, which is, and the superlative for the first one is the mind fuck. And so I really like books that deal with really heavy philosophical issues and problems, and that are extremely deep and often rather dense. And the book that I'm putting here for this one is The Sirens of Titan by Kurt Vonnegut, which I first read when I was 17 years old, and it blew my young mind at the time, and I read it again a few years ago, and it blew my mind again. I think it is so good, and so provocative. I love that it not only asks the question, what's the meaning of life, but also provides its own answer, and it's just so good. The second superlative is the epic. So I love books that are epic in scope and in style as well. And so, you know, I love reading ancient epics, medieval epics, modern epics, 19th century epics, whatever. And the book that really, I think, established me as a reader of epics is the book that I used to call my favorite book of all time. I'm not so sure anymore, but my former favorite book of all time, The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. His kind of prequel, I guess, to The Lord of the Rings, which starts with the creation of Arda, the world in which The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion, of course, takes place, and the creation of the sort of angelic beings that sort of manage the world, including Middle-earth, and the conflict with Morgoth, which sort of was the seed for the conflict that we see in The Lord of the Rings, but which was actually a lot more epic than the conflict in The Lord of the Rings. And it's just an incredible work, in my opinion. It's dense, it's not always easy, it can be frustrating, much like a lot of my favorite books, much like Moby Dick, which is the book that I would probably now call my favorite book of all time. But it is full of compelling characters, absolutely glorious prose, and it's just incredible in my opinion, and that's a hill I will die on. Number 3, the third superlative, is the gritty. I really like things that are gritty and have a kind of darkness to them, and that are often kind of sort of violent, and that deal with the darker side of human nature. And the book that I think really established this aspect of my taste is Macbeth by William Shakespeare, which speaks for itself. You know, of course, the whole idea behind the story is that a relatively good man, Macbeth, becomes a monster and ends up as the villain of his own story. And it's just an incredibly powerful work, you know. I mean, if you see a production, there is a production with Ian McKellen and Judi Dench on YouTube, and I recommend that production so much. It really drives home just how really gripping and heartbreaking it is, actually, and just how dark it is. So that's the third one. The fourth superlative is the hopeless romantic. You know, the hopeless romantic does not show his face very often on my channel, I think, but he is there. You know, I am a lover of opera, for example, and I talk about that a lot on my channel, and I think you do kind of have to be a hopeless romantic to love opera, and I do love tragic love stories, and I also love love stories that end well. But the love story that I went with for this superlative is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. You know, just a magnificent novel. I will die on that hill. This is another book that's sort of kind of polarizing. There are people who hate it. There are people like me who just adore it. I am one of the ones who absolutely adore it. And again, I will die on that hill with my friends. And yeah, and I have an honorable mention for this superlative, which is Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. A lot of people love to talk about Romeo and Juliet and pretend they're being very edgy and interesting and intelligent by deriding it, and really I think that's misplaced. I think it's a perfect play, basically, and yeah, I will die on that hill. The fifth superlative is the humanist. I have a strong feeling about the dignity of people and the worth of people as, ends in themselves. And the book that really, I think, inspired this aspect of my reading and myself is The Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which I have heard some people talk about as though the main theme of it is like self-interest, is like only helping yourself. And I take issue with that perspective. Marcus Aurelius emphasizes on every page of this book the importance of compassion and doing good to others. My favorite quote from the book, one of my favorite quotes of all time, is, "Men exist for the sake of one another, teach them then, or bear with them." And that's such a humanistic sentiment, I think. And and it has been an inspiration for me for a long time. The sixth superlative is the existential nihilist, which might seem a contradiction from the humanist, but there is again a darkness to my personality, as we can see in my book taste, in my musical taste, in my movie taste, in basically every aspect of me. There is a darkness to me, but there is a light, as I've already touched on. But there is a morbid side to my sense of humor, which I don't let out that often because it's not to everyone's taste. But anyway, the book that I think really inspired this aspect of my taste as a person and as a reader is Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche, in which he basically calls into question all former values that had been of importance before his time, whether they're from religion or politics or whatever. He calls them into question and challenges us all to create our own view of the world rather than to take it from other people. And then the honorable mention for this category is Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. Samuel Beckett, who I often cite as my favorite writer. But Waiting for Godot is about two men waiting by a tree for some guy named Godot who never shows up. And this is a metaphor for all of human life. And I take that very seriously, and I take it with all of its tragedy and all of its humor. The play is a tragic comedy, not a tragedy. So that's the sixth superlative. Number 7 is the spiritualist. So a lot of you know, if you've watched my channel for any length of time, that I have an intense interest in religion, but also just spirituality in general. Not necessarily like reading spiritual texts that often. I don't read a lot of spiritual texts. I do have an interest in religious texts, but I do take a sort of spiritual interest in nature and in the world around me, and I think my relationship with literature is very spiritual. My relationship with music is certainly very spiritual. My relationship with film, I think, is very spiritual. And the book that really, I think, got me going on this was The Case for God by Karen Armstrong, in which she it's not so much a book that is trying to convince you that a God exists, but so much as that she's taking to task the new atheists who've become very popular in our modern world, and critiquing the model of God and religion that they criticize constantly, and saying that it is not the historically accurate version of what religion is. Religion and God are a lot more fuzzy and full of doubt and full of uncertainty and angst than the new atheists seem to think. The new atheists seem to think that religion and God are all just about knowing exactly what the world is and knowing that God exists and so on and so forth. And they critique that. I mean, rightly so. That sort of perspective would be incredibly dogmatic and closed-minded. But Karen Armstrong argues that is not really what religion is in its best form. There of course are religious fundamentalists who do see the world that way. But she talks about religion and God in its best form. And reading the book was just an incredibly profound experience for me, and I still love it. And there are actually two honorable mentions here, and it's the Bhagavad Gita as translated by Eknath Easwaran, and the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. And yeah, these are just texts that I return to frequently that are full of quotes that I take inspiration from, and full of sentiments that I try to apply in my own life with, with mixed results in terms of my actual, ability to rise to the occasion and do it. So, but yeah, so the eighth superlative is the poetry reader. So I'm a big reader of poetry, as you all know. And the book that really, really set me off on my quest to read poetry was The Best Poems of the English Language by Harold Bloom. And it's a little bit ironic that I'm bringing this up in a tag that was created by Kelly, because Kelly posted a video at one point where she kind of gave a little bit of a rant about this book, about Harold Bloom's introduction being extremely sort of patronizing and condescending and so on and so forth. And, there's something to be said for that. But as an anthology, this is just wonderful. It's a wonderful introduction to poetry written in English, to the major poetry that's been written in English. And it was the best way for me to get into reading poetry. And Harold Bloom's individual introductions to various poets in the book are really superb. They tend to be rather short. Some of them do go on at length, like the one for Shakespeare. The one for Milton is rather long, but most of them are relatively short, just biographical introductions to some of the author's major themes and so on. And it just has some great stuff in it. It introduced me to Hart Crane, Wallace Stevens. It got me to read more Shakespeare. It got me to start reading Milton. It got me to read some Chaucer. And yeah, it made me the poetry reader that I am. And so I'm forever indebted to it. And obviously I've gone on to read a lot more poetry. Number 9, and the superlative here is the Shakespearean. So obviously I'm a host for Shaktember, as it's going to be called this year, which is an annual event taking place in September celebrating William Shakespeare. And yeah, I love Shakespeare. I think, he's arguably the greatest writer ever to have worked in the English language. And the book that turned me into the Shakespearean that I am is, again, by Harold Bloom. It's Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. And this is not a perfect book by any means. A lot of people are intensely critical of it, and I have been intensely critical of it on the book on this channel. But it influenced not only my view of Shakespeare, but my view of the world, I think. And it just opened up to me just how wonderful Shakespeare is, how full of depth he is, and how beautiful his plays are. And it is a book that I do return to on occasion. So, yeah. And then finally, the last superlative is the lover of life stories. So I love reading memoirs. I love reading autobiographical fiction. I love reading biographies, or I'm starting to love to read biographies more. And I just like learning about people's lives, whether it's in a biography or an autobiography, or whether it's through history or something. I just love learning about people's lives, about people from diverse backgrounds' lives. And I think the book that really inspired this for me is Lit by Mary Karr. And you might have expected me to say her first memoir, The Liars Club, and I do love that book as well. But Lit is really the book that showed me just how powerful memoirs can be, and how much of an impact they can have on you. This is a memoir of her not only becoming a poet, but becoming a mother and a wife, and also an alcoholic, and recovering from that, and finding faith, which is very interesting. And yeah, so if there's any book that could have gotten me interested in learning about people's lives, this was the one to do it. So that is the My Reading Life in 10 Books tag. Thank you for sort of tagging me, Kelly. I'm just going to tag one person. I am going to tag my friend Noah from Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse. So I'm looking forward to hearing your answers, Noah, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.